Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy Quek. Thank you for coming to this workshop of mine. Not really used to this kind of format in terms of videos, but I suppose this is the time where we all have to adapt to new realities. I've been asked to speak on the topic of the mental health during the times of pandemic. And so as I considered what to speak on, the topic of worry came to mind. And so for some of you who have actually looked at the description of this particular seminar, you will find me having called it Worry, the Giant That Wearies the Soul. I'm going to share out my screen with you so that you might be able to see some of the things I'm talking about on PowerPoint, and that should guide our way through so that it wouldn't be um, information that's missing. So we have about 45 minutes together, and I hope to be able to kind of cover some of this material within this period of time, and then there will be time for Q&A for us. So as I said, the topic is called Worry, the giant that wearies the soul. And in my description of this particular seminar, I go back to the story of David, King David, as he takes on the task of trying to retake Israel. And during those days, the giants were in the land, from the land of the Philistines, and they were hardened fighters and very powerful indeed. Yet the experience of fighting with Goliath down the valley of Elah gave a lot of confidence to the people of Israel as they battled these giants. So David and his mighty men were led into one battle after another. And a particular passage in scripture describes David as having become extremely weary as a result of the ongoing battles. And in his weariness, a giant sees him. And this giant had a new sword. It rushes towards him and tries to take David down. Of course, I'm not going to talk a little about that the details of that passage. You have to read that yourself from 2 Samuel. But the idea, of course, is that in our day and age, it's been extremely wearying walking through this pandemic season. And the giant that wearies our soul, I call it worry. But really, in our pandemic journey, we have various things that are happening that I think lead us to worry. So I want to talk about 4 specific things that are very evident in our pandemic journey. The first of those things that's extremely clear is the idea of fear, or rather the feelings of fear. Fear is something that is very deeply built within us as human beings. It's an instinctive response to those things that might be able to harm us. And not surprisingly, in this season, fear is one of the major emotions that a lot of people feel. It doesn't matter where you are in terms of your status in life. And for those who are younger, maybe you feel as if you have this invulnerability syndrome and you have less fear. But for those of us who are a little bit more, what do you call that, in the older or in the high risk category, fear becomes a real thing because it is a self-protective mechanism. So I'm going to define fear. Fear is an instinctive response to perceived threat. Because that perceived threat really can be real in terms of the way it affects individuals with high risk factors and so on and so forth, or it can be perceived threat as in unreal. And so there are people who are afraid of certain things in regards to the pandemic that may or may not be grounded in science. But regardless of the situation, is an instinctive response to perceived threat. What happens when an individual becomes frightened of something, when fear kicks in? As I said, this is an instinctive response. And so really it's a response that comes from deep within our physical and emotional makeup. And to that, we go to how the brain works. See, deep in the brain, or in the deep brain, there are certain structures, the amygdala being one, that governs the emotional part of of our response to fear, and then a structure which is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus activates like a GPS of the brain. It gives us locational information about fear. What happens in the fear response is the hippocampus activates along with the amygdala that gives us the emotional response to fear. The physical response to fear, the physical spaces of fear, causes us to begin to identify spaces and things around us as being associated with fear. And so you get this in the pandemic response. That's what I'm discovering for a lot of different people. I don't know if you actually have the same experiences as I do. And that is prior to the shutdowns, people gathering and having watch pictures of people around mingling in close quarter spaces did not have any kind of emotional response to me. But a few months into our physical distancing, when I see a picture of people gathered close together without 6 feet apart, without any masks on, having drinks and food, laughing with each other, and there's this response that goes on within me. It's an instinctive response to perceived threat. That's the hippocampus. The hippocampus activates us, and it causes us to have this involuntary response of what's going on and wanting to kind of change spaces for ourselves, make us move apart. And so, really, this social distancing is actually incorrectly named. It's actually physical distancing. Physical distancing becomes now this emotional response. I need to push away from you. I need to, and yet at the same time, the hippocampus is saying to us, we need to be able to figure out how we might be able to find safety. So if I were being chased by a bear, for example, in the woods, I'm walking along, I'm feeling as if like there's nothing in the world of care, and then all of a sudden I hear a grunt. I look over and there's a sow bear on his hind legs and it's staring at me with jaws going and then it's growling at me and it's gotten down on four legs and it started charging at me. My hippocampus kicks in. I turn around and I run, and what this hippocampus does is that it tells me, go forward, go as fast as you can. You know where to go. Where's your nearest place of safety? I forget everything else. And everything around me becomes blur. That's called, in fact, the bandwidth reduction. When the hippocampus kicks in, we become very clear in our bandwidth as to what we should do to escape. And what else is that everything else becomes blur. I find this a very interesting response in our pandemic journey. People are becoming a lot more selfish. People are beginning to look after only certain things. They're yelling at each other for not wearing masks. They're doing things with each other for which are not necessarily very common in our civilized society, but it happens. We don't care about our neighbors as much anymore. When somebody walks by, the first thought that we have is that this guy have COVID. There's a cough of someone across the street, and you're going, oh no, I'm going to stay away from that home, even though you've known each other for a long time. So the hippocampus activates, and our bandwidth begins to grow smaller and smaller and smaller, and become more and more selfish individuals. But more than that, what happens is that we engage in what I call, and usually is called, the fight or flight response. We begin to either run away from situations or we put up our fists for fighting. We're seeing this on a constant basis in boardrooms or even on Zoom rooms or even in situations of walking in a grocery store, somebody comes on in and there's a fight or flight situation that happens. Police are called and people are taken down. Some have been extremely badly hurt, and you wonder to yourself, what is happening to us as human beings? Answer: it's an instinctive response to perceived threat. There's a fear that's going on in our pandemic journey. But another thing that actually that's coming very clear in a pandemic journey is isolation. Now, that's something that I don't even have to talk much about, except that I'd like to begin to talk about it as a concept that creates far more emotional response than we bargained for. Isolation is simply for us, well, a description of what's happening today. Doors are shut. People are not going. Well, yes, the sun shines out. We're connecting on Zoom, but isolation is still there because isolation, by definition, is a perception of diminishing connectivity. We don't connect with people as well. Maybe a phone call, yes, but that's one way of connectivity. But it's diminished connectivity when it comes to face, when it's compared to face. Now, beyond that, we're going to classes by Zoom. We're doing all kinds of different things by Zoom. When we see each other, even face to face, we've got what? A mask over our face, diminished connectivity. So it's not just simply a perception. And remember, perception doesn't mean it's unreal. Perception can be real, but it's the way we see things. And this perception creates certain things of diminished connectivity, creates certain things, one of which has to do with monocular cognitions. Well, what do we mean by that? What monocular is, of course, is binocular, you see both eyes, monocular, as you see in one eye. But here in this particular case, it describes cognitions, the way we think. Monocular cognitions is this: when a person has no other way of bouncing ideas off, cross pollination of ideas. You say something that someone is saying, are you kidding? That's a pretty crazy thought. Or, wow, that's really funny. I don't believe you said something like that. Or, man, that's extremely intelligent. We don't have that kind of feedback if we have diminished connectivity. However, what happens in this monocular cognition is that there's a certain degree of distortion that comes because our ability to solve problems, our ability to see clearly becomes affected, or think clearly becomes affected. Now, beyond that, there's a problem that we actually then develop because when there's less connectivity, our emotional needs become really magnified. I'll talk about that later. But then we look for stimulation of other kinds that are not necessarily good. Now, back in April, a study was done here in Ontario and across Canada, actually, in regards to the kinds of mental health issues that are occurring during our pandemic. And one of those issues is addictions. This is primarily what this is talking about, the problematic stimulation substitution. People are looking for ways to substitute in some way this connectivity. And when disconnectivity occurs or diminishing connectivity occurs, we look for other things to stimulate us, which includes drugs, or which includes pornography, or which includes all kinds of different things that may or may not be healthy for us. And what unfortunately occurs is that when we do so, then there is a susceptibility to, increase susceptibility to our uh, predispositions. And those predispositions might be depression or might be anxiety. There are some people who come to our season honestly having already issues with depression, with anxiety, somewhat under control, basically under control because they know what to do with themselves. They go out for runs, they meet with people, they do all kinds of different things. They sit down with a therapist, they do all kinds of things to help them keep balance. What happens with isolation is that there's increased susceptibility to these sorts of predispositions of anxiety, depression, and other things, including addictive behaviors. So, what occurs during isolation is that there is an increased, um, what do you call it, weakness that we have when we have less and less connectivity with others. The third thing I want to talk about is uncontrollability. You see, what happens in this season is that we suddenly recognize there are certain things, or many things, we can't control, and they can become obvious. When our Premier Doug Ford gets up in Ontario here and makes an announcement, we are all on tenterhooks. What's he gonna do? Is he gonna back us into phase two or whatever zone we might be in? Or how are we gonna be like it the next time? And there's an uncontrollability. Why aren't people being more careful? Why are there so many new cases? What's happening in all these kind of situations is that the statement simply to us is that we are not in control. I define that as the inability to govern one's own emotional, internal, environment or external environment, regardless of the environment that's not being under our control, our governance, it really has to do with this sense of being lost, of being unable to tell our whole world how to behave. Now, understandably, we cannot be in control of everything, but some of these things don't really matter. How much water falls across over the Niagara Falls here in Ontario doesn't really matter to me. Whether or not that it's going to be cold or warm the next day, yes, it does matter, but it only matters as to how I dress. But when it comes to more fundamental things of the inability to control those things that I need every single day to even function, this uncontrollability issue becomes more and more devastating. Of course, what happens is that external and internal control becomes unbalanced. We have what's external control? My ability to control what's around me. What's internal control? My ability to control my moods, how angry I get, how irritated I get. Usually, we try to keep those two things in balance, the external control versus the internal control. When we're under stress, we go out to exercise. That's because external control and internal control can be simply balanced. When we're tired, and we can lie down and take a nap. When we are unable to do something, we can ask for help. Internal, external control is always balanced in some way as an instinct. Now, mind you, some of us have difficulties with internal, external control to begin with. During this time of uncontrollability, this imbalance increases. And not only does it increase, but then we create far more salient problems in our situation, which include boundary issues. People now start working from home. Work from home sounds like a good concept because there's a bed to sleep on. There are things that you could do. You can get up and get a drink. Nobody's going to look at you and say, "What are you doing?" Nevertheless, those are boundaries that we need to keep. When we get out of the house, when we drive down the highway, we actually go into the work and the doors open for us and the lights are on and we're sitting at our desk, we realize in our heads, somewhere within our spirit, that we are in a different place. We are in different boundaries. And so we work. We're able to do various things that are there. Now at home, there are no boundaries. Time becomes really flexible. We're checking emails from work late into the night. Things that are happening in the morning, meetings that we begin to miss because we can't get up because we're staying up late at night watching. So boundary issues becomes really difficult. And also, it's very difficult to establish and keep boundaries when everything is virtual. Not only are boundary issues now more and more difficult, and that remember, this actually leads to a sense of uncontrollability. There's a magnified perception of needs. All the things that I need now are much larger than life. That's because my sense of the ability to govern my own environment becomes less and less, so my needs seem to be greater and greater. Because really, our needs are oftentimes balanced by emotional control, internal control, environmental control, external control. When those needs don't have those controls as balance points, what happens is that they become more and much greater. So you find individuals with high amounts of expressed needs. And I need all kinds of different things. I need to be respected. I need love. I need sex. I need all kinds of different things. They are now all out of control. Huge because there are no boundaries. There's an absence of control that's within our internal, external control in our lives. One more. I said four. In our pandemic journey, there's a fourth thing. And this has to do with fatigue. Fatigue really has to do with this physical tiredness, but also an emotional tiredness. It's a deep weariness that wears the soul. I had a young woman. She's in grade 12. This is a young person, um, should be full of energy. And yet at the same time, she's staying up late because there are no boundaries of going to sleep, getting up early because she has to be in class. She's on video Zoom all the time. 2 Saturdays ago, her mom calls me and says, "You need to see her." And I said, "Why?" because she's depressed. What's happening with her? Well, she lay down on the floor on a Friday afternoon and she fell asleep on the floor in the kitchen. And when I tried to wake her up, she was a bear. There's a weariness that goes on in our souls that goes way beyond what we can even begin to imagine. Because most of the times we have our boundaries all around us. We have signals as to how we are able to think. We have binocular cognition. People are saying, "Hey, you look pretty worn out. Why don't you take a break?" But we don't have those things. So fatigue begins to take over. And one of those things that happens is what I call channel exhaustion. Channel exhaustion is basically this: when we use particular channels, or rather we overuse particular channels. So, for example, what you're doing right now, you're watching me on video. How much video time have you spent today? How much start time in front of a screen, sitting at a desk, not moving, talking to people over the course of a screen, not having anyone talk to me, which is what's happening right now with me because I'm making a video. Those channels start to get exhausted. And then when we want to rest, what do? Well, we open our computer and do emails. We watch YouTube. We turn on the screen again and watch a movie. And that channel slowly gets exhausted to the point where we are so deeply tired, but we don't know how to rest. But as well, there's a loss of rhythm. Remember, I talked about boundaries? Time boundaries is a major one. We don't have this rhythm of wake, sleep, do things, go to work, come home, say hi to certain people, children come home at a particular time. Those rhythms are out of control. And once rhythms are out of control, we are children of rhythm. Our biochemical system runs by rhythm. Our sleep-wake circadian cycle runs on rhythm. Our ability to rest and ability to activate runs on rhythm. When we are start getting extremely fatigued, our rhythm goes out of control. But not only that, also there's motivation deprivation. Then now we become extremely demotivated. That leads to, for a lot of people with predispositions, remember I talked about that, into identification of depression. So they plunge into very deep places. Or when you have no motivation to do anything, then your heart begins to race and you get really anxious. And so a lot of people move into this particular phase of fatigue without really realizing it. This is unfortunately our pandemic journey today. And you'll find maybe first month, everybody thought, it's going to be over in 3 months. Second month, third month, we had 8 months into this and counting. All right, I got it. There's hope at the end of the tunnel. Our stock prices are going up, and certain things like our vaccine responses and so on. But there again, there's hope. And when hope's dashed or hope's delayed, what happens is that this fatigue gets even greater and the pandemic response becomes even more evident. So, four things: fear, isolation, uncontrollability, fatigue. These four things conspire together to create this thing called worry. Let me show you how it works. First and foremost, fear feeds in to the fundamental core of what worry is. Worry is a form of fear. And as this worry begins to develop and we begin to isolate ourselves from those who are around us, this isolation then begins to feed into our soul. And the isolation creates a sense of, let me back up a little bit. I'm hitting buttons too quickly here. So then the isolation then begins to wear on us and become more and more worrisome because we are unable to see more, and we begin to narrow our field of vision in terms of our ability to solve problems. That's fear. And we begin to be unable to see the forest for the trees. And so what happens is that uncontrollability becomes now the middle of our concern, our sense of being unable to control other people, ourselves, our whole environment becomes more and more worrisome. And of course, as 1 month goes into another, fatigue occurs. And each of these things feed into worry and feed into each other like this ever cycling thing. And now, of course, in our present time, we've had more uh, named hurricanes than any other time we've had. But this hasn't to do with that. But it is like a hurricane. It is like this cyclone that goes round and round and round, gathering strength. So worry becomes a major issue because it it really stands on these four legs of fear, isolation, uncontrollability, and fatigue. So let me help you us out here a little bit, at the risk of thinking that maybe we all know what we are talking about. We have the same sense of what it is. So let's do this. What is worry? Now I've described four things on which worry stands. But there's a lot more to worry because it's common ailment to many of us. Some of us actually pride ourselves as, well, yeah, I worry all the time. And when my mom was a worrier, and I learned very early that people can actually worry about nothing. In fact, she told me at one point, which is very comical. She looked at me one day and she was very worried. I said, "What's going on?" And she says, "Well, I'm not worried about anything." "Oh, that's good." And she says, "Well, I'm wondering how come I'm not worrying. I'm worried about my not worrying. I'm worried about my not worrying." Interesting. What is worry? So fundamentally, this definition of worry comes from a lot of research that has come in the area of stress, in the area of anxiety, of depression that stretches for decades back. And so here is a simple definition of worry they can all work with. A working definition. Worry is an inability to stop thinking about that which we cannot control. Simple enough? Worry is an inability to stop thinking about that which we cannot control. Now, I want to put it technically for us, for those who say, that sounds a little bit mamby-pamby. Let me put it a little bit more in terms of some more technical language. Worry is the obsessive thinking. That is, the inability to stop thinking about those things over natural uncontrollables. I'll describe these two things. Natural uncontrollables, what are they? And obsessive thinking, what are they? So to do that, let me just split those two things in half. So that's worry. Worry is the obsessive thinking over natural uncontrollables. So let's do this. Let's first and foremost talk about the left-hand side, obsessive thinking. What is it? Worry stands on those four legs and it really fits into our pandemic problems, our pandemic journey. But this thing called worry needs to be resolved within us. If we begin to attack this thing called worry and solve these two issues of obsessive thinking and natural uncontrollability and resolve them within us, then the pandemic journey isn't always like this whirlwind that goes downwards and flushes us into some nether sewer. What happens with obsessive thinking is this. Obsessive thinking constantly comes into our minds and we don't seem to be able to stop it. We're thinking about something all the time. It goes around in circles. We keep returning to it and returning to it. But oddly enough, we don't recognize its power. So my first thought behind this, and I've helped individuals to try to kind of deal with worry. And the first thing that these for us to do is to identify it. Identify the thoughts that we obsessively cycle around. What are they? Oh, you say, why should I even? I don't want to talk about. Yes, you do, because really you keep thinking about it, but you don't call a spade a spade. I am obsessing over this. What are you obsessing? I'm obsessing over my next board meeting. It's really terrible. I'm obsessing over this particular person who has his axe ground against me. I'm obsessing over the fact that there aren't enough finances to do this or the. I'm obsessing over the. Identify it. Tell yourself not to run away from the giant, but face it. Identify your obsessive thinking. Secondly, concretize that. And by concretize, I mean to make it like concrete. Uh, Write it down. M- Get yourself to see it, to know what it is. Writing it down is really important. Talking about it is one thing. You need to be able to talk about it, but concretizing is writing down, getting yourself to identify it, and then say, this is what I obsess over. Be really a spade to spade person. You say, this is what I concretize or I obsess over. I've got to do something about this. That I now you might be so prolific in your obsessive thinking that you fill a page. But usually obsessive thinkers don't fill a page. In fact, the definition of obsessive thinking is there's one or two thoughts that you can't get out of. So might as well do yourself a favor. Identify them, concretize it, write it down. I'm not talking about big long journal. You could do a journal if you want. That's nice. That's good. Actually, a lot of people who talk about this whole notion of dealing with issues by journaling is really a means of concretizing your thoughts. But in this particular case, because it's obsessive thinking, write it down, whatever that thing may be, and then what I call de-chunking. De-chunk them, take them apart. You see that one thought is monolithic, is huge. Well, split it up a little bit, wouldn't you? I don't like so and so talking about me. Well, let's take that apart, shouldn't we? I should say, well, there are other board members who aren't that bad. He only talks, when he actually talks bad about me, only it comes to finances or he talks about my time, how I use my time. Usually he's okay. No, I like his wife. It's him, I can't stand. But really, she's a nice person. I thought, and really, I've known him for 5 years only. I may not know all his issues. So you take that one obsessive thought and you break it up into many, many smaller chunks. That's called de-chunking. De-chunking an obsessive thought allows you to actually deal with it a bit at a time and begin to see that it's not this huge monolithic thing, but really much smaller pieces. Then schedule them. I'm not talking about avoid dealing with these things. That's why I say call a spade a spade. You identify them, you concretize them, you de-chunk them, but when do I start thinking about this? Well, when do I start dealing with this? Schedule it. Put it in your schedule. And then don't think about it at all if your schedule doesn't call for it. Maybe you have to deal with this particular assignment that you've been given, a financial thing that you need to deal with, a, 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 a task that you need to accomplish. Schedule it. And beyond that, tell yourself when it's not on my schedule, out of sight, out of my mind. I have to think about it. No, you don't. You're overthinking it. Remember? You're overanalyzing it. So schedule it. Then you can think about it when you need to. But the next thing is to deny them. In other words, to say, I'm not saying deny that it actually occurs, but to say to stop thinking about it. That's what we meant by denying them. Stop thinking about it now. It's not the scheduled time. I've dechunked them, and it's all these pieces only, not the others. I've made them concrete so I can see it. I've identified it. So let's stop thinking about it or overthinking about it. But how about natural uncontrollables? Our world is populated by uncontrollable or controllables and uncontrollables based on our own limitations and driven by our own focus. Now, our world has lots of controllables and uncontrollables. That's a written in thing. We know that. For example, what's going to happen to this virus? Is it controllable or uncontrollable? Well, for some people it's controllable, but really it's uncontrollable for us in our world. Our world is populated by controllables. Do I wear a mask or what? What kind of mask do I wear? How can I distribute the mask to all the people who are around me? Is, is there a way now to actually look at the bylaw, interpret it accordingly, and still be within the bylaw and do the things that I need? That's the controllables. It's based on, nevertheless, our own limitations. And what's a limitation? Well, it's quite simple. A limitation is the fact that I may not have the resources to do it, or I may not be able to do it because of my time, or I may not be able to do it because I just don't have the abilities. Well, that's our own limitations. But it's also driven by our own focus, where we put our mind to. It's interesting because on the other side of the scale, we are obsessive in our worry. But when it comes to things that we can control, we are unable to focus on things that are positive, controllable. So I want to actually give us end up by talking about this a little bit more: controllability and uncontrollability. I call that these unnatural controllables two things: the controllables and the uncontrollables. Two simple things. But before we do that, just one more statement about controllables and our focus and limitations. Such limitations are limitations, whether or not we can do something, our resources, whether we have enough money, and so on and so forth. These limitations of control are dynamically determined. It changes, in other words, by what we choose to focus on. Now, this is a very important statement. I mean, if you have the ability to take a picture of this, you need to. Such limitations that we actually experience of control are dynamically determined by what we choose to focus on. Now, let me illustrate this for you because I think this is such an incredibly important principle that we all need to know and determine for ourselves. Understand this. Our focus is on if our focus is on the controllables, the things that we can control, our influence increases. You saw that line move from one side into the squeezing out the uncontrollables. If our focus is on controllables, then it becomes more and more things become controllable to us. Take that as a principle, so I'll illustrate later on. But the opposite of that is true. If our focus is on the uncontrollables, watch what happens. It squeezes out the controllables. If our focus is on the uncontrollables, our influence decreases. In other words, where you focus your mind on, your obsessions, in other words, have to be changed in such a way that it focuses only on those things you can control. And that's a very difficult discipline for warriors. People who can't seem to get rid of their obsessions, for one. Secondly, they keep obsessing over the uncontrollables, the natural uncontrollables. That becomes a poison pill. It's almost as if you take two elements and add them together, it hardens before you. Um, our focus becomes on the uncontrollables, our influence gets less and less. Now, let me illustrate this. Let me illustrate this for a little bit. Let's just say you have that back in the balance, right in the middle. On the one hand, uncontrollables. When COVID-19 will end? It's totally uncontrollable. Well, maybe you think you can control it by wishing to end, the law of attraction or whatever. But it's not the case. That's not biblical. That's not possible. It's not reality. When can COVID-19 end? Well, that's somewhat uncontrollable unless you're one who actually knows how to manipulate this thing, this novel virus. But on the other hand, there are controllables. If you are a camp director, it doesn't matter when COVID-19 will end. I'm going to start inviting speakers for 2021. And people are going to look at you and go, why inviting speakers 2021? We don't know when COVID-19 will end. You're right. Because when COVID-19 will end, it's uncontrollable. Inviting speakers for 2021 is controllable, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to focus on what I can control. Here's an example, okay? Another example is, will people respond and come? Well, you have your board meeting, someone will put up their hand. I guarantee you, of that circle of individuals who are well-meaning, beautiful Christian people, someone is going to be a warrior. Someone is going to be a concrete thinker and say, how do we know that people will respond and come? And you can look at that person, you have my permission to say, sir, ma'am, that is not controllable, and we are not going to focus on that. What we can focus on is crafting a convincing campaign. In fact, I've got certain things I've worked on already to try to craft a convincing campaign. Why? Because my focus is on the controllables. Now, the principle is, remember, If I focus on what is controllable, it increases my sphere of influence. If I am able to craft a convincing campaign and invite my speakers, because they're super speakers, nobody is inviting anybody but me, of course, because I'm focused on the controllables. Well, guess what? People will come and respond and come, even if I had to be creative and get people on Zoom or do whatever, do a hybrid, really, it will work if I'm doing the two things. And here's another uncontrollable. Will those I love get ill? Now, will I get ill? I know I can be trying to be careful, hide behind a stove all the time, let coronavirus burn itself off, because it doesn't work that way. But maybe what happens to those I love? My grandkids going to school, or whatever, who live in Toronto. It's terrible down there. Or my loved one in long-term care home. What will happen to these people? Will those I love get ill? Well, bad news for us. It's not controllable. Therefore, you cannot focus on those things. It's difficult. Don't you love your grandma? Of course you do. But you cannot focus on whether or not she'll get ill. What you can do is to take reasonable precautions. So again, focus on the controllable, not the uncontrollable. When it's uncontrollable and you do your control ledger sheet, this is a control ledger sheet, as it says, you begin to actually exercise that, and you say, no, even though I'm really concerned about those who get ill, I am not going to do that. I'm not going to get so caught up in that. I'm going to take reasonable precautions. I'm going to set up those precautions and maybe warn the long-term care home to be able to do certain things, warn grandma not to do certain things. Maybe you can take those precautions and have her not run by fear, not run by isolation, not run by fatigue, not run by uncontrollabilities, but focus on controllability, taking reasonable precautions. Now, we are people of faith. I'm assuming that. This is, after all, CCI. So, what does the Bible say about this? Is this a think positive and it'll work and things will go well? No, it isn't. Because the Bible says this. It says to you, have faith in those things which are not granted to you to control. God says to you, lay your faith before him and say, God, I have nothing to do with this. I can't do anything. I have faith in you. You are God who can never deny himself. You are faithful. But on the area of controllables, you have to do something about the way you live, and that's be faithful. Jesus himself said this. He who's faithful in little will be faithful in much. Don't go burying your stuff in the ground. Don't go pocketing it somewhere and not even investing it. How do I know the investment will pay off? You don't. Be faithful. Be faithful in what you have. When you can't have any control over the interest rates, over business, have faith. So everything in scripture points in this direction as how to live as people of faith in this world. What did Jesus say? He climbed on the top of a hill as he began his public ministry. It's called the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7 in the book of Matthew, just in case you're wondering. Right smack in the middle of that Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about worry. Interesting, isn't it? When he tells you about the thing about the kingdom as to how we are to live it, he talks about worry. And he says, which of you, by worry, can add an inch to your head? Now, these are uncontrollables. These are natural uncontrollables. Put that on the right side of your control ledger sheet, please. You can't add an inch to your head. You can't do anything that you have not been granted control over. Oh, you can wear platform shoes. Got it. I understand that. Yeah, you can have surgery and lengthen your shins. You got it. But you know what? Leave to God what's God's. Then he says this, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Your ability to do that. Be faithful. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these uncontrollable things shall be added unto you as well. That's Matthew chapter 6:33. Your whole idea is being faithful is to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things are uncontrollable to be added to you as well. Really, it's talking about the shifting of that middle line. If you understand this control ledger sheet and you learn how to control your obsessions and you say, God, I'll be faithful in what you give to me. I have faith in what you haven't given to me. I'll stop the cycling of these obsessive thoughts. Then what happens is fear does not feed into worry. And worry does not feed into my isolation. And isolation does not feed further in my worry that feeds now into my sense of, of, of being unable to control my life. And then my uncontrollabilities don't drive my worry that makes me even more and more fatigued. I no longer stand on the four legs that run our pandemic. So be faithful, have faith. I hope this seminar has helped you. I'm going to unshare right now and turn our time over to our moderator if that's necessary, or perhaps for those of us, you have questions after this video, maybe we have the opportunity for you to do so. Thank you. And we flip from video now into our live Zoom.